We have 50 states to choose from.
We lay everything on the altar for the truth.
What happens when the heir to a billion-dollar Christian empire finally speaks out? Jonathan Lamb has broken his silence, and what he's revealing about Daystar will leave you rethinking everything you thought you knew. From whispers of betrayal to shocking behind-the-scenes secrets, his words are shaking the foundation of one of the most powerful ministries in America. Could this be the moment the truth finally comes to light? For years, Jonathan Lamb stayed quiet. He was the son everyone expected to carry on Marcus Lamb's legacy, the heir to a Christian media empire worth billions. People saw him on stage, in broadcasts, and at events, and assumed he was fully on board with everything happening at Daystar. But behind the scenes, Jonathan carried doubts that he never voiced. There were questions he wanted to ask, choices he struggled with, and things he saw that didn't sit right with him. But if his decision to put Michael's skulls in a chute, leg turnals, was a one-and-done thing, the weight of silence became part of his daily life. He smiled for the cameras, played the role he was expected to play, and tried to convince himself that this was all part of honoring his father's vision. But deep down, the silence began to feel like a prison. When Jonathan finally decided to break that silence, it wasn't with anger or revenge. It was with a heavy heart. He knew what speaking out would mean. The headlines, the rumors, the backlash, and the disappointment of people who looked up to him. But he also knew he couldn't carry the truth alone any longer. Too much had been hidden behind polished broadcasts and carefully managed public images. There were questions about money, leadership, and decisions that didn't line up with the values Daystar claimed to represent. The more Jonathan stayed quiet, the more it ate at his conscience. And at some point he realized silence was no longer an option. His revelation was like a crack in the wall. For years, viewers believed Daystar was untouchable, a beacon of truth that could do no wrong. Jonathan's voice shattered that illusion. He didn't come forward with wild accusations or dramatic claims. Instead, he spoke as someone who had lived inside the system, who knew it from the ground up, and who had wrestled with the tension of faith and image. He admitted that not everything was as it seemed. He admitted that there were secrets, compromises, and hidden struggles. And once those words were out, the world couldn't unhear them. The internet exploded. Clips of Jonathan's confession spread quickly, and people began to ask questions that had been buried for years. Where did the billions go? Who was really in control? Why had Jonathan, the chosen heir, stepped away so quietly when the throne was waiting for him? The silence he broke wasn't just his own. It opened the door for a larger conversation about Daystar, about leadership in Christian media, and about the cost of protecting an image at all costs.
That was the time we were more ready than ever. I mean, it was the wrestle and breaking of me begging God, when will Jonathan be ready?
For Jonathan, speaking out wasn't about tearing down his family or the ministry. It was about honesty. He wanted people to see that behind the lights and cameras, there was a human story of pressure, expectation, and struggle. He wanted people to know that success on stage doesn't always equal peace at home. And most of all, he wanted to make it clear that integrity mattered more than titles. By breaking the silence, he traded safety for truth. And while that decision cost him influence, comfort, and even relationships, it also set him free. Jonathan's words marked a turning point. They showed that the legacy of Marcus Lamb wasn't just about carrying a torch, but about choosing how to carry it. He could have stayed silent forever and enjoyed the platform handed to him. But instead, he chose to speak honestly, even if it meant losing everything. That's what made his revelation so powerful. It wasn't the details of the scandal alone, but the courage to finally tell the truth when silence had been the safer choice. Jonathan Lamb was never just another face in the Daystar family. From the moment he was old enough to sit in the studio, people whispered that he was the one who would take over after his father, Marcus. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It was written into the DNA of the ministry itself. Leadership plans were drawn up, signed, and agreed upon. Jonathan wasn't a maybe. He was the heir, the one expected to carry the torch of a billion-dollar Christian empire. And for years, Jonathan leaned into that role. He didn't sit in the background, waiting for things to be handed to him. He learned the ropes. He preached, hosted programs, led staff, and got his hands dirty in the daily grind of ministry life. To viewers watching at home, Jonathan looked every bit like his father's successor. He carried the name, the presence, and the natural authority that people respected. The path looked clear, and no one doubted where it would lead. When Marcus passed away in 2021, that expectation only grew stronger. People assumed Jonathan would naturally rise to the top, stepping into the role of president, carrying on his father's vision and keeping the family empire alive. And for a while, it looked like that was exactly what was happening. Jonathan was named vice president. His wife Susie was given a bigger role. Their paychecks grew. Their influence expanded. On paper, everything lined up perfectly. The heir was in place. The throne was waiting. But behind the titles and pay raises, Jonathan began to feel something he couldn't ignore. He realized he wasn't just stepping into leadership. He was stepping into a system. That system came with rules, spoken and unspoken. It meant protecting an image at all costs. It meant staying silent when decisions didn't sit right. It meant smiling on camera while questions gnawed at him inside. The very throne he had been promised came with invisible chains, and Jonathan began to wonder if it was worth it. Late at night, Jonathan and Susie would sit in their home and wrestle with questions that wouldn't go away. They weren't bitter, but they were burdened. Was this really what God wanted for them? Were they being faithful leaders, or just actors in a story they didn't fully believe in anymore? To walk away from the throne seemed unthinkable. Who gives up something that most people would fight for? Who turns down the chance to lead a global ministry? Yet the more they prayed, the clearer it became. Holding on would mean losing themselves. Jonathan wasn't blind to the cost. If he stayed, he could enjoy stability, recognition, and power. He could raise his kids in comfort, surrounded by the respect his last name carried. But he also knew he'd be trading his peace for that comfort. He'd be teaching his children that appearances matter more than honesty. And that realization cut deep. The longer he sat in the role, the heavier it felt. He started to see that his inheritance wasn't just a blessing, it was also a trap. So Jonathan made the unthinkable choice. He walked away. Quietly, without drama, without anger. No tell-all interviews, no fiery posts online. Just a decision to step back, even though it cost him everything the world thought he wanted. He gave up the role of president. He gave up the stability of a guaranteed paycheck. He gave up the public platform that had defined his whole life. To the outside world, it made no sense. Why would the heir turn down the throne? Why would he abandon a path that had been his since childhood? But to Jonathan, the answer was simple. Because the throne wasn't worth his soul. He realized that leadership without peace isn't leadership at all. He understood that protecting an image isn't the same thing as protecting faith. And he knew deep down that walking away wasn't failure. It was freedom. The decision wasn't easy. It came with fear, loss, and long nights wondering if they had made the right choice. Jonathan and Susie weren't walking away rich. They didn't have secret millions stashed away. They had a mortgage, bills, and kids to care for. Leaving Daystar didn't mean stepping into luxury. It meant stepping into uncertainty. But they believed that God would meet them there. What makes Jonathan's story so powerful is that he walked away not out of anger, but out of conviction. He didn't slam doors or tear down the ministry. He simply refused to live a lie. And in doing so, he redefined what it means to lead. Leadership isn't always about holding on to power. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to let go. Jonathan was supposed to be the heir to a throne. Instead, he became the man who turned it down. He chose peace over power, conscience over comfort, and truth over tradition. His story reminds us that success isn't always about climbing higher. Sometimes it's about stepping down. And sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is walk away. Rebellion doesn't always come with loud speeches or dramatic exits. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in choices that no one sees at first, in decisions that seem small but carry the weight of a lifetime. For Jonathan and Susie Lamb, their rebellion wasn't about storming out of Daystar in anger or turning their backs on the ministry in some fiery confrontation. It was about quietly refusing to live a lie. It was about looking at the path laid before them, the path everyone expected them to walk, and deciding they couldn't keep going, not if it cost them their peace, their honesty, and the truth of who they really were. From the outside, it didn't look like rebellion at all. Viewers saw Jonathan smiling on stage, leading worship, speaking passionately, and appearing to step naturally into the role his father had left behind. They saw Susie supporting him, graceful and poised, a partner in faith and in family. To the world, the Lambs were doing exactly what was expected of them. But behind the cameras, behind the polished stage lights, a quiet struggle was growing. Jonathan and Susie would sit late at night in their living room after the kids had gone to bed, asking questions that had no easy answers. Is this really what God wants? Are we staying faithful, or are we just going along because it's safer? Those late-night conversations became the birthplace of their rebellion. There was no shouting, no big declaration, just two people wrestling with the tension between expectation and conviction. Jonathan had been told his whole life that leadership of Daystar was his destiny. But what if destiny didn't match peace? What if the crown everyone assumed was his to wear was actually chains he couldn't bear? That was the reality pressing down on him, that stepping into the throne might mean stepping away from himself. At first, the rebellion looked like hesitation. Jonathan hesitated to sign papers. He hesitated to approve decisions that didn't feel right. He hesitated to put on a smile when something inside him said, "This isn't what it looks like." Susie saw it too. She felt the weight every time Jonathan came home drained, not from the work itself, but from the performance of it all. The expectation to keep everything polished, to stay silent when something was off, to play a role instead of living truth. That silence was suffocating, and slowly, they realized they couldn't keep it up. The rebellion grew in the smallest of ways. Jonathan started asking more questions in meetings instead of nodding along. Susie began voicing her unease about decisions that seemed more about protecting the brand than protecting people. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it was noticeable. And in a system that thrived on compliance and image, even small acts of honesty felt like defiance. They weren't trying to burn anything down, they were simply trying to breathe. But even that, in a world built on control, was rebellion. When people think of rebellion, they picture fireworks, explosions, noise, headlines. But Jonathan and Susie's rebellion was quiet, almost invisible. They didn't storm out of boardrooms. They didn't post angry rants online. They didn't start a new ministry to prove a point. Instead, they chose silence where the system demanded performance. They chose peace where the world expected ambition. They chose to walk away quietly, knowing it would cost them dearly. And that cost was real. By stepping back, they lost more than titles. They lost financial stability. They lost influence. They lost the sense of certainty that came with knowing their future was secure. For years, they had dreamed of finally having stability, finally being able to provide without stress. But when the moment came, they couldn't keep it if it meant losing themselves. So they laid it down, not with anger, but with trembling hands and heavy hearts. The hardest part wasn't leaving the platform. It was leaving the illusion. For so long, people assumed the Lamb family was untouchable, wealthy and powerful. But Jonathan and Susie knew the truth. They were just like everyone else, trying to pay bills, raise kids, and find peace in a world that never stopped demanding more. The public saw polished stages and thought millions. But behind closed doors, there were budgets, debts, and sacrifices. Their rebellion was a rejection of that illusion, a refusal to keep feeding the myth that ministry equals money and image equals truth. What made their quiet rebellion so powerful was its honesty. They didn't try to spin it into a new brand. They didn't market their departure as some bold new season. They didn't seek sympathy or attention. They just left. They chose a smaller life, a quieter life, one without applause, but full of peace. And in doing that, they made a louder statement than any headline could have captured. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply walk away. For Jonathan, the rebellion wasn't about rejecting his father's legacy. It was about honoring it in a different way. Marcus Lamb had built Daystar on faith and vision, but Jonathan realized that following God sometimes means breaking with tradition. His rebellion wasn't against people, it was against the idea that image matters more than truth. For Susie, the rebellion was about protecting their family, about showing their children that success isn't measured in stages and cameras, but in living with integrity even when it costs you everything. They could have stayed. They could have collected the paycheck, played the part, and kept the system running smoothly. No one would have questioned it. In fact, most people would have applauded them for carrying on the legacy. But Jonathan and Susie knew that applause without peace wasn't worth it. The rebellion was choosing conviction over convenience. It was saying no to power when power was handed to them on a silver platter. It was refusing to perform for a world that wanted a show when their hearts longed for something real. The beauty of their rebellion is that it wasn't loud, but it was lasting. It didn't create headlines, but it created freedom. It didn't win them fans, but it gave them something more precious: honesty, integrity, and peace. And in a culture obsessed with image, that kind of quiet rebellion speaks louder than any staged performance ever could. Their story is a reminder that rebellion doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like calm. Sometimes it looks like two people sitting at a kitchen table, deciding together that they'd rather lose everything than lose themselves. It looks like walking away with no plan, no safety net, and no applause, trusting that truth is worth more than titles. It looks like silence, where the world expects noise, and peace, where the world demands power. Jonathan and Susie Lamb didn't set out to be rebels. They set out to be faithful. But faithfulness in a system built on image is rebellion. And that's what makes their quiet choice so radical. They didn't fight for a throne. They didn't cling to a crown. They let it all go. And in letting go, they discovered what real freedom feels like. That is the power of a quiet rebellion. It doesn't shake buildings or topple empires overnight, but it shakes the soul. It inspires others who feel trapped in their own systems of expectation and fear. It whispers a simple truth. You don't have to stay. You don't have to perform. You don't have to trade peace for applause. You can walk away. And sometimes, walking away is the most rebellious thing you'll ever do. For most of his life, Jonathan Lamb thought leadership meant one thing: following in his father's footsteps. Marcus Lamb had built Daystar into a billion-dollar Christian media network that reached millions around the world. He was known as a bold, passionate leader who carried vision and authority. Naturally, everyone assumed Jonathan would inherit that same mantle. He had grown up in the spotlight, learning how the ministry worked from the inside out. He could preach, host, and carry himself on stage. On paper, he was the heir apparent. The plan was official. Documents were signed. Conversations had been had. Jonathan wasn't just a possibility for future leadership. He was the plan. Leadership, for him, was supposed to be a crown waiting to be placed on his head. And for years, he carried that expectation quietly, almost like a weight on his shoulders. But the more Jonathan grew into the role, the more he began to realize that leadership isn't always about power, titles, or visibility. It isn't about stepping into the spotlight because everyone assumes you belong there. Leadership, he discovered, is more about the kind of person you are when no one is watching. It's about integrity, about peace, about living in a way that doesn't betray your soul. That realization didn't come quickly. It came over years of small compromises, quiet frustrations, and late-night conversations with his wife, Susie. Together, they would ask the same questions again and again. What are we really building? Who are we really serving? Is this about God, or is this about image? Those weren't easy questions to face, especially when the world around them kept telling them that they were living the dream. Jonathan's old idea of leadership was about carrying on the family legacy. But as he stepped deeper into the system, he found himself losing touch with the values that had shaped him. He was expected to keep silent when things didn't feel right, to smile for the cameras even when his heart was heavy, to keep the machine running even when it didn't align with his conscience. That's when the cracks began to show, not in his abilities, but in his understanding of what leadership really meant. To Jonathan, true leadership began to look less like holding a title and more like holding on to his convictions. It looked less like giving speeches and more like living in peace with his choices. It looked less like climbing higher and more like stepping down when the climb demanded too much compromise. Walking away from Daystar was never the plan. It wasn't a decision made lightly or in a burst of anger. It was the slow result of realizing that leadership by title meant losing leadership of his own heart. Jonathan could have stayed. He could have inherited the presidency, collected the paycheck, and kept the cameras rolling. He could have lived out the life that had been written for him long before Marcus Lamb passed away. But deep down, he knew that would mean betraying himself. And so he and Susie redefined leadership, not just for themselves, but for anyone watching. They chose to step down quietly, without bitterness or drama, and rebuild a life that matched their values. That choice showed that leadership isn't about staying in control of a system. It's about knowing when to let go. It's about choosing integrity over influence, peace over performance, and truth over tradition. In many ways, Jonathan's story flips the script we're so used to hearing. We live in a world where leadership is measured by numbers, followers, views, dollars, power. The higher you climb, the more successful you're supposed to be. But Jonathan showed that sometimes the greatest form of leadership is walking away from the climb altogether. He proved that leadership isn't always about being on stage. Sometimes it's about being brave enough to leave the stage. This new definition of leadership didn't come with applause. it came with loss. It meant losing financial stability, losing influence, and losing the comfort of a guaranteed future. But it also came with freedom. Freedom from pretending, freedom from compromise, freedom from the weight of a crown he never truly wanted. That freedom, though costly, became the proof that real leadership can't be bought or handed down. It has to be lived. Jonathan and Susie's quiet choice has since inspired others who find themselves caught in the same struggle. People in ministry, people in business, people in families where the expectations don't match their hearts. Their story says, you don't have to accept a title that doesn't align with who you are. You don't have to hold on to power just because it's offered. Leadership isn't about how much you hold, it's about how faithfully you live. And maybe that's the heart of redefining leadership. It's no longer about crowns, thrones, or empires. It's about character. It's about the small, unseen choices that prove who you really are. It's about leading not by demanding respect, but by living a life that quietly earns it. Jonathan walked away from the throne everyone thought he was destined to take, but in doing so, he stepped into something far greater. He showed that true leadership isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. And in a world obsessed with power and image, that kind of quiet strength may be the rarest and most powerful form of leadership of all.